Okay, so I'm going to change directions just a little bit. We talked about, retained ownership for beef cattle in Hawaii. Dylan went through a decision support tool that he developed while he was on sabbatical here in conjunction with Mealani and I and Shannon. Now we're going to focus a little bit on grass-finished beef production. So, one of the key things to help for, one of the key things that's helpful for our industry is that our livestock producers need to have market options, right? An ability to go and make the best decision about where to market their animals at any given time. And if that means, retaining ownership or selling at the gate for shipping the animals to the mainland, then that's valuable for them. On the other hand, having an option to also retain ownership or hold on to those animals and finish them out on grass and then for a local slaughter is another option and one that's also valuable. One thing we do know that over time, shipping costs are always going to increase. And at some point, the cost of that shipping might be more than what the value of that animal is. And that means that you need to have an option locally to harvest those animals so that you can sustain your business model. So, kind of understanding that, the University of Hawaiʻi has been doing research on the potential for grass-finished beef production in Hawaii for a long time. I've been here for 20 years. They were already doing it when I arrived. And so my colleagues back prior to my coming here, Glenn Fukumoto and several others, were already engaged in trying to understand what it would mean to have a grass-finished market in Hawaii. And over the years, we've continued to look at that and develop some research on actually finishing the animals, looking at carcass quality, and what drives consumer preferences for grass-finished beef. So this presentation is really kind of trying to put all of that together. Over the years, through some grass-finished beef production trials that we've been running at Mealani, we've put together a model and proved that model, and we've gotten some really good data. And then Dylan has come along and helped us develop a decision support tool. Just similar to the one that he did for retained ownership, we also have one on grass-finished beef production. Now, it's not ready for prime time just yet, mainly because I've been a little bit slow getting my writing done. So we have a publication that will go along with that tool that we want to get done when we release it. But you're going to see the initial decision support tool a little bit later after this presentation. We'll go through it. But a lot of this data that I'm going to share with you today underlies the function of that decision support tool. So we're going to talk about, in this presentation, what factors control meat quality in context of how it affects grass-finished beef production. We're going to talk about some basic management practices for grass-finished beef production, things that need to be concerned about, and then we're going to talk about how to evaluate the animal for market readiness. Okay. So when we think about meat quality, there are several factors that influence the quality of the carcass that animal will produce. Obviously, animal genetics is really important, right? Good genetics, good carcass, right? Forage quantity, okay, how much of something that they have to consume, and the quality of that forage over the production cycle of that animal is extremely crucial. The age of animal at slaughter, okay, and all of these things right here you can control. Animal genetics, forage quantity and quality, and age of animal at slaughter. You control those, okay? What you don't control are the climatic conditions that affect the forage production and the performance of that animal over time. You don't make it rain, so you can't stop the drought. You can't keep it from getting too cold. Those things you don't have control over. but we can manage around those conditions a lot of times, okay? Sometimes that management around those conditions can be kind of expensive, like we were talking about in the drought management, right? You know, supplementation is not cheap in Hawaii, right? But if we were strategic about it, maybe we can get through those really rough times a little bit better. So we need to have a really good understanding of how these factors go together to influence the production of that meat on that animal, okay? So when we think about carcass quality traits, well, we measure quite a few different things. There are really three big factors that influence the way that consumers experience the meat that they eat, okay? One is marbling, two is the ribeye area, and the third one is tenderness. So marbling is intermuscular fat. That's the fat that's inside the muscle. It affects the juiciness and the flavor. It's a function of high energy to protein ratio late in the fishing phase of that animal. It's related to animal genetics, highly heritable traits. Ribeye area is related to the carcass size. So the USDA standard is a 12 to 15 square inch ribeye. This yields an 8 to 12 ounce steak that's 1 inch thick. Okay? And again, it's more or less a function of genetics as it affects carcass size, right? So the third one is tenderness. And this is the one that consumers identify with the most, okay? It's a function of the animal's age at the time of slaughter, and it is heritable, and it's correlated with high butterfat milk content in the animal, in the mother of the animal. So those are the three, and we're going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. So marbling is a result, again, of that diet, high in energy, late in the animal's production cycle. Okay, so intermuscular fat deposits only after the animal's reached about 65 to 70% of its mature body weight. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, 65 to 70% of a 1,200-pound mature body weight animal is anywhere from 780 to 840 pounds, okay, at 12 to 16 months of age. So at 12 to 16 months of age, we have to make sure, if you're going to finish those animals on grass, that they are in a high plane of nutrition. That's when we want to have the higher energy content of the food that they're consuming. Now, this is easy in a feedlot system because we can feed them the high concentrate feeds, things like grain and corn. Okay, they're higher in energy than forages, so it's easier to deposit that intermuscular fat on grain than for forages. Most grass forages have half or less the energy than the fed grains. Okay, so therefore it's going to be more difficult on grass to really get that intermuscular fat content in there, right? Keeping that in mind, and so consequently, grass-finished beef are always going to be leaner than grain-fed beef. And there's not going to be any exceptions to that, actually. So energy content in forages is highest in the early maturing phase of the grass growth, this early maturing reproductive phase, to the boot stage. So the boot stage is the terminal point at which the quality of that forage is going to be sufficient for that animal. Boot stage is simply that point at which the seed head hasn't fully emerged from the grass leaf sheath, right? So that's that early boot stage. And that's kind of where we're shooting for. That's a high energy point of the plant. It's also a point in which we got fairly good quantity of grass, okay? So those grass-finished animals need to be on that high rate of gain, on high energy forage going into that slaughter to assure the quality marbling and tender product, okay? That's what we're kind of shooting for. Not always easy on grass, but that kind of gives us something to shoot for and where to look at. So ribeye area, again, is related to carcass size, and it's a function of the animal's genetics. Larger animals tend to have a larger ribeye area, but larger animals also have a higher energy requirement to maintain their production and to gain weight, okay? So the ribeye area, really, it comes from a grain-fed standard, the USDA standard. So again, pointing out that the ideal ribeye area is between 12 and 15 square inches, which will yield that 8 to 12 ounce steak 1 inch thick. It doesn't get larger than that because larger ribeyes are too expensive for the consumer. Okay, they can't afford to pay for them so much in the market. But on the U.S. grain-fed beef industry has basically resulted in large frame animals, since finishing on grain is typically more efficient. And so I recently was over in Boise for a meeting, and I had a chance to go to the Simplot feedlot and slaughter facility. The feedlot in Grandview, Simplot feedlot in Grandview is 120,000 head of cattle. It's huge. It's the largest feedlot that I've seen. And there was cattle clear across the valley, 7 hospital units in that feedlot, 20 pen riders working every day. And so it was pretty amazing to see. But I would estimate that over 90% of the cattle in that feedlot had some Charolais influence in them. I saw dairy Charolais crosses. I saw everything crossed with Charolais. And I saw pure Charolais in there as well. So there's a lot of influence in Charolais. And why is that? Because Charolais tend to be very large frame animals, and you can hang a lot of meat off of their carcass. And because you can put it onto them in a feedlot in a relatively short period of time, the industry is moving in that direction because they want those large frames. Easy to put on because you can put a lot of energy into those animals in a feedlot system. Whereas on grass, you don't have that luxury, right? It takes a long time to get a large carcass up to weight on grass. You just don't have the energy to go into them. But that's interesting. And you think back to what the cattle industry in Hawaii has done over the years, right? I mean, starting off with cattle from Vancouver days, then they brought in, Hereford cattle in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Everything was Hereford, almost clear up until the 50s. And then Angus cattle were kind of introduced. And now with the movement of cattle back to the mainland, and we're not having too much local slaughter, a lot of Charolais cattle have been starting to be introduced into. You can think some of the large ranches are already introducing Charolais in as their terminal process, right? So, that's just the movement to fit what is on the mainland market, right? To fit that feedlot market. Nothing wrong with that, right? But if you're going to retain some of those animals for grass-finished production, and their carcass size, their mature body weight is 1,300 to 1,400 pounds, it's probably going to be really difficult to get them in at a point in which their age and tenderness match up, line up. And we'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So at Mealani, we started out, we were able to finish, so the grass finish standard is to finish at an early age of 20 to 24 months. I'll talk to why that's important here in a minute. At around 1,200 pounds on grass, the beef animals need to be early maturing and moderate framed animals. This means that the standard for ribeye area for grass-finished beef might have to be something smaller than what is ideal at the USDA level, right? For a long time at Mealani, our ribeye areas were something under 12 square inches. In fact, we were averaging about 11.6 square inches. Through some genetic selection and other things, we've actually gotten that ribeye area up a little bit larger now, and so we're well within the 12-inch. But it's going to be really rare for us to hit on grass that 15 square inch ribeye area. Okay, but anything between 12 and 15, depending on other factors, is going to yield a choice to a prime animal, right? So it's not that bad, right? I mean, 12-inch. And still hitting choice or prime is not anything to sneeze at, right? Okay, so tenderness, and tenderness actually is probably the prime meat quality factor that drives consumer satisfaction. Okay, I'll show you some evidence in here in a minute. It's highly heritable. okay, we can genetically select for more tenderness. There are some trade-offs. When we genetically select for one trait, we're trading something off for another trait. But basically, this tenderness can be is highly heritable. It's possibly correlated with high butter fat content in the milk. Genetics being equal, however, tenderness is a function of the age of the animal at slaughter. Tenderness can be affected by several things. The first thing is periods of no gain or weight loss at any point in the production cycle of the animal. Okay? And that goes from the birth to slaughter. And if we get a period of no gain or weight loss, it's going to result in a loss in tenderness. Okay? And of course, the magnitude of that loss in tenderness is going to be dependent on the magnitude of those periods of no gain or weight loss. Okay? So we have to make sure that those animals are on a high plate of nutrition all the time. And if any point, we lose the forage base and they go through a period where they're not gaining well, we risk losing that tenderness. Periods of fasting or lack of water immediately prior to slaughter, okay? This increases the glycogen and the pH of the muscle, and that'll decrease the tenderness of that animal. No matter how hard you work, if you don't provide them with enough water immediately prior to slaughter, you risk losing the tenderness of that animal. Okay? And then after slaughter, too rapid of a cooling post-slaughter. So these lean carcasses are prone to cooling too rapidly, causing muscle to be cold shortened and toughened. Because they're lean, okay, they can go through this cooling, post-muscle cooling and cold shortening period. So we want to avoid these. So what are these things? These are quality control factors right here. So the first two, the livestock manager manages. These are things that you can control, right, for the most part. If you get them into the slaughter facility and they go overnight or for a day or two before they get slaughtered and they're not fed or they're not watered, that's not necessarily in your control. That's on the slaughter facility. The third one is a slaughter facility control point, right? So these are quality control factors. These are things that people can adjust and influence. And there have been several studies on tenderness and grass-finished beef in Hawaii, which help us define or help us refine what we see as the ideal model for Hawaii for grass-finished beef. So research by Miller et al. In 2001 looked at shear force stress for muscle, for ribeye area, and consumer satisfaction in relation to the shear force strength of the meat. Okay, and so what they found is that 86% of the consumers were satisfied with a ribeye steak that had a shear force of 4.3 kilograms or less. Okay, and so the larger this number, the tougher the meat is. The lower that number, the more tender it is. So up to 4.3, we can retain almost 90% of the consumers. After 4.3, if we go 4.4, 4.5, 4.6, we start losing consumer satisfaction value, right? Okay. So thinking about this 86% satisfaction level, that 4.3 kilograms, that kind of helps us set a standard, okay? We want to have our steaks, we want to have the meat tenderness value, shear force value, something below that 4.3 kilograms. Now this is shear force measurement by one type of system. There are other ways of measuring meat tenderness, and they have different values to them, but they're relatable. But you may read something in another one that has a different value or different scale to the values, and so you just have to be aware that there are different ways of measuring this. So early on in the study, looking at Hawaii samples, only 26% of the grass-finished beef in Hawaii actually fit that criteria back in 2000. Okay. They looked at, this is out of the University of Hawaiʻi study, looking at the shear force value for animals that went through slaughter locally here and aged by teeth. Okay, so as that animal is aging, you can see that the shear force value is increasing. Here we have the 4.3 cutoff. That's the minimum, or this is the maximum value that we want. We want our steaks to actually be more tender than this. This maximum line of 5.21 is actually where we almost lose all of our consumer satisfaction. Okay, this would be like eating a steak that chews like the bottom of your boot, right? So this is probably what we don't want, right? And so knowing what those boundaries are, okay, so 4.3 all the way up to something less than 5.21, and you can look at about 36 months, we're almost at that 5.2 shear force measurement. At 24 months of age, we were just about 4.75, not that far off from that, still within the range of having a fairly good consumer satisfaction value, probably not 90%, probably more like something between 75 and 80% of consumer satisfaction. So this becomes a maximum for age, right? 24 months, okay? Anything beyond there, and we start to lose the tenderness value in that animal, and we start to lose consumer satisfaction. Why is consumer satisfaction important? Well, if you want your consumers to come back and consume your meat all the time, you got to have a consistently tender product. If one time they eat it and it's really good to them, and they come back the next time and it chews like something trying to chew that table up, they're probably not going to come back to it, right? Or even if they get it the first time and it's tough, they're not going to come back to grass-finished beef. So we want good quality, consistently tender product to get our consumers to come back, okay? The first sale is great, but it's the sales that follow up after that are what are sustainable, right? So if we don't have repeat customers, we're not going to have a sustainable business. Okay, so thinking about tenderness, age limit, and we got to think about, well, how do we get that animal there? If we got to slaughter them before they're 24 months, how do we get them there? A couple things we need to keep in mind are that the larger the body size, okay, the higher the maintenance cost of that animal in terms of energy. So they have to eat more groceries the bigger they are, right? So this graph kind of depicts this. This is off of data here, and it shows the amount of energy and subsequent maintenance energy that's needed by a dry beef cow of a given size. Okay, it's pretty linearly related. So as you go from 1,000-pound body weight to 1,100 to 1,200 to 1,300, you can see the amount of calories that animal has to bring in every day goes pretty dramatically up, right? So linear relationship. So bigger body, more energy, and if this is just maintenance, then that means that they don't have any extra groceries for lactation, or if they're a growing animal, they don't have any extra groceries to put on meat, to put on fat, okay? This is just relating to maintenance costs. So but the relationship there is important to understand. So kind of putting that into context, we said that grass-finished animals need to be early maturing. That is, that they need to reach slaughter weight at a young age, something less than 24 months. So they need to be a moderate frame. So we suggest that has to be between 3 and a frame of 6. Okay, and this chart right here kind of depicts some information on here. So frame score from 3 to 8. Okay, and you can see starting at a frame score of 3 at maturity. Here's their hip height. Frame score is measured at the hip of the animal, and so you can actually measure this. And so you go from about 52 inches to 62 inches in about 5 frames, okay, for these animals, so from 3 to 8. And why that's important is because because knowing these values, we can find an expected slaughter weight for those animals with a 1/2 inch of back fat cover, okay? This is a USDA green-fed standard, but it relates to those animals. And so we know from a 3-frame animal, our expected slaughter weight would be about 1,000 pounds with a 1/2 inch of back fat. On the other hand, an 8-frame animal, which is 62 inches, which is just over 5 feet at the hip, okay, is going to finish out at about 1,500 pounds, okay? Our cutoff for that moderate frame is about 6, a frame score of 6. So at 58 inches at the hip height, not that much smaller, it's only about 4 inches shorter at the hip height, but we lose about 200 pounds difference in there. And so we have a 1,300 pound carcass, or a 1,300 pound live weight, excuse me, at a frame score of 6, right? So understanding this relationship allows us to calculate a few things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The next thing that's important that you understand is your environment, right? Is your environment conducive to finishing those animals? You need to have adequate quantity and quality of forage and able to get those animals to weight, to slaughter weight in that amount of time. And not all land is necessarily suitable for grass-finished beef production. So a university study, and we published this, and these are available online. We looked at the forage types and the different precipitation zones and elevations, and we evaluated them on their potential for grass-finished beef production. And we produced these maps and some extension publications to go along with it. There's one for the Big Island, one for Maui, and one for Kauai. We have one kind of on hold for Oahu. We had a problem separating out the golf courses from actual pasture land on Oahu because there's a lot of golf courses. But this is the one for the Big Island, for example. And so those lands that are suitable either fall within 2 categories. Low and wet lands, those lands between 0 and 2,000 foot elevation and over 50 inches per year, or those high and wet zones that are over 2,000 foot and above 30 inches of rainfall zone. Why are these important? Why is that rainfall important? Because you need to have sufficient amount of production. You can't go through any part of the year where your forages dry out or your forages mature and they're not growing, because what happens in that period? The animals stop gaining weight, and we lose tenderness, right? And they're not going to reach weight by the time they reach 24 months. So anywhere that we have seasonality in the forage production becomes less suitable for grass-finished beef production. It's not to say that you can't do it, but you've got to be more flexible in those environments than you would, say, here in these green areas. This is the Camwilla, the Waimea Plain, and then we have areas up Mauka and Kona, and then over here on the south end. So these green zones and these dark orange, I don't know, this is kind of reddish orange here. It kind of looks a different color here, but this is the same zone here as this one here, okay? Those areas that are not suitable or more suitable for, say, other types of grazing, cow-calf production, for example, are in the yellow, blue, light blue, and I don't know what color that is, pale green, I guess. And so those areas are more suitable, say, for cow-calf production. So you have to be able to match your animals to the environment that you're going to raise them in to make sure that you can sustain the productivity of those animals. The forages are really important that are growing in those areas. We know that a lot of this Waimea Plain and over here on the Kohalas is all kikuyu, pangola grass, along with some other types of grasses. And that's to say that they're suitable as long as those pastures are in really good condition. If the pasture condition has deteriorated because of whatever reason, and it's not supporting those types of forages, then it may not be suitable at that point. So you need to evaluate the land that you're there, make sure that you have the type of forages that are highly productive, that have good nutritional values, and can sustain those animals over that time. Okay. This is for the other. On this one, there's actually a list of the type of forages that we would expect in those pasture systems that would make it valuable for that type of grazing. So in 2009, there was some research that came out of Argentina that suggested the following parameters. They suggested that there should be an annual average daily gain greater than 1.7 pounds per day for grass-finished beef production. Okay, even upwards of 1.8 pounds per day in the last 90 days of the animal's life. We need the animal to finish at around 22 months. Definitely not over 30 months, and that you may want to consider weaning at a later date. We did some stuff at Mealani looking at weaning at a heavier weight. In other words, holding them on the mother for a longer period of time. The best gains you're going to get are when they're on their mom, right? You're going to get something over 2 pounds a day, at least, at a minimum. Fairly consistently, year after year or whatever, and so that's the best time to have the gains on there. You can't keep them on the mother forever because you need to rebreed her, right? But so there's a point at which you basically have to wean the calf. But the longer you can hold them on there, the more weight you can put on while they're on the mom, the less pressure you're going to put on their grass, and the less time you have to carry them on that grass, right? So you got to find those points. The data that we did, we looked at 600-pound calves, 500-pound calves, and 400-pound calves, and we carried them out to slaughter weight. And the 600-pound calves performed better than either of the other two. Okay, so they came out heavier. We had better quality product at the end, and they finished out, and they all finished at roughly the same time. But because we waited a little bit longer, those calves had more time to grow on the mom. It was better. So if you're looking to do grass finish, retaining those calves a little bit longer on the mom and weaning at a heavier weight probably is going to be beneficial. Okay, so we wanted to take some of this data from Argentina, and we wanted to test it out with, what we do on the mainland, what we do at Mealani, and then we also developed a feedlot production model, just so we kind of understood how those two things, how the Argentina model, what we're doing at Mealani, related to what's happening in a feedlot system. Okay, so we started with some model assumptions. So we started with the average birth weight of 80 pounds. All the animals we put into the model started at 80 pounds. We should assume that the average daily gain of the animals while they are on their mother is about 2.1 pounds per day, which is actually our average for Mealani. And then we developed the feedlot production curve. Everything was assumed to finish at 1,200 pounds on the finish weight. For the feedlot, we weaned them after 6 months at about 450 pounds. They go into a stalker phase for 6 to 18 months, or about 390 days, gaining 375 pounds at a rate of just less than 1 pound per day. Then they went into a feedlot phase from 19 to 22 months, about 120 days. They gained another 375 pounds at a rate of about 3.1 pounds per day. Okay, so the birth to slaughter average daily gain comes out to about 2.1 pounds per day. Okay. Then we built our grass finished production curve. This is the model using the information from Argentina. We weaned them after 8 months at about a 630-pound carcass. From 9 to 22 months of age, they were on grass for 420 days, gained 570 pounds. Their average daily gain was about 1.36 pounds per day from birth to slaughter, or on grass, and their birth to slaughter average daily gain is at 1.7 pounds per day as suggested by the Argentine model, okay? So we ran these two models against the Mealani's production numbers, and this is kind of what we came out with. So the blue line here is the feedlot model, okay? Basically, everything just goes into a backgrounding program. They're not really, they're growing, but they're not really gaining a lot of weight, and then we want to put a lot of weight onto them at the end of that cycle, at the last part of their, while they're in the feedlot. The gray line here is the model using all of the information from the Argentina research, okay? And the red line is actually what we saw at Mealani, okay, in terms of our gains. So the Mealani, we weaned at 6 months, at 180 days, roughly 450 pounds. They gained about 2.1 pounds per day of average daily gain while they're on their moms. From 6 months to 22 months, or 510 days, they gained another 750 pounds. Their gain on grass was 1.47 pounds per day. And so that works out from birth to slaughter about 1.78 pounds per day. So Mealani, we were able to do just a little bit better than the Argentine model, okay? And our grass was a little bit more productive than what the Argentine model would have predicted. The Argentine model was looking at about 1.36 pounds per day. We were getting about 1.47 pounds per day on average, okay? So this told us that we at Mealani, and probably fits a lot of this Waimea plain, that we fit that model pretty well and we could get there. So when we start thinking about doing things, grass finishing on a commercial scale, we want to make sure that, we're optimizing our potential for our pastures. And, if we are understocked, you're losing money because you're not utilizing the grass that's there, right? If you're overstocked, you're going to lose money because your animals aren't going to be producing as well. So it's really important that you find the right balance for your system, and particularly when we're doing grass finish. Now, grass finish production is not the same as raising cow-calf, okay? And we can tweak the systems, we can tweak things around and understand where we can get the most performance. So a couple things that are really important to understand is the relationship between animal production and grazing intensity, both on a per animal unit basis and on a per area basis. Now, typically we don't want to base our economics on a per animal unit level production, because if we're always maximizing for each individual animal that's out there, we're going to be underutilizing the resources, okay? It's usually better for us to calculate things on an economic basis, on a per unit area basis, okay? And that's really what this graph is depicting, okay? Grazing intensity here, we're talking about, stocking rate, okay? So over here is the low stocking, over here is a high stocking rate, okay? As stocking rate is increasing, we have changes in this solid line, which is an individual animal basis measure, okay? And you can see how it behaves. This is data that comes out of several research projects, research back in the 80s and the 90s coming out of Wyoming and several of the western states. Some looking at tropical systems in Florida. They all follow these very similar trends, okay? So individual animal performance at first is maximized at the lower end of your grazing intensity. But as you continually add animals to that system, you start to see individual animal performance decline. Why is that? Well, there's less and less resources available for each added unit of animal to there, right? Competition. As soon as they start competing for forage, okay, then their body performance, their production is going to start to decline, okay? If we were managing all the time for individual animal performance, you wouldn't want to cross this threshold right here, right? Because as soon as you do that, individual animal performance is going to go down. But you're at this end of the scale, you're drastically underutilizing the resources that are available, right? On the other hand, if we look at it on a per unit area basis, you can see that it's going to rapidly increase as that grazing intensity goes up. Grazing intensity, we're increasing the number of animals per unit area, and at some point we're going to peak, right? And it's at that peak that we're at the best economic value for the ranch. Here you only got a few animals. Here you've got a number of animals that's balanced with the system, okay? On this side of this curve, you're underutilizing the system. On that side of the curve, you're overutilizing the system, right? So this is the balance here, okay? So the practicality of this graph, the information that goes into this graph comes out this way. If we were to separate out things like solar energy capture for the pasture, right, and against grazing intensity. So basically the pasture can capture so much energy before you put any animals in there. It's capturing and photosynthesizing and producing a certain amount of energy. And it's going to be maximized at some point. As soon as you put animals in there and they start consuming the leaf matter off of that pasture, the ability of that pasture to capture more energy is going to decline. As you add animals, each incremental step in number of animals decreases the capacity of that pasture to generate more energy, okay? So the energy in a particular pasture is finite, okay? And so at some point you're going to run out, okay? So as grazing intensity goes up, solar energy capture of that pasture or that area is going to go down. Harvest efficiency basically talks about how much of that total available energy that's in that pasture in the form of grass leaves is utilized by the animals, okay? So as grazing intensity going up with each incremental increase in stocking rate, the efficiency or the amount of that harvested material over that pasture that's consumed is going up. And then if we look at then grazing intensity and assimilation efficiency, and assimilation efficiency is basically how much of the energy that's in that pasture is available to each individual animal, okay? And so the ability of each animal to assimilate the energy, okay, in that pasture is going to decline as we add individuals to that pasture, right? Because they're competing with each other. You're spreading that limited amount of energy in that pasture among more animals, right? So if we understand these dynamics, we can understand how it's going to influence both the individual animal performance and that unit area basis. And of course, the key point here to get down to is that we want to find the right point in our production system on a commercial basis where we can be sustainable at what we're doing. Okay? If we're doing grass finish, what is that value that keeps us sustainable? We're not overutilizing the system. We're not causing declines in animal performance. Okay? Or on the other hand, if we're grass finish, if we're doing cow-calf production, we want the most number of calves that we can produce, right? So what is that balance, okay? And if we want to do some combination of those, then we have to figure out how to balance those scales, okay? The last little point I'm going to put out here, and then we're going to come back to this curve here in a minute, is that visually, we can go out and measure pasture production and we can calculate our stocking rate, and there's always error in that estimation. And at some point, that whether or not our error is above or below the actual stocking rate of that pasture, it's going to be reflected in the performance of our animals, okay? If we are constantly overestimating our stocking rate relative to what's actually there, then we're going to be utilizing more of the forage than what's available, and it's going to start to show up. Our cows are going to start coming skinny, and we're going to wonder, right? And we're going to have to adjust the way we do things. So there are some factors to keep in mind, and so visually inspecting your animals will always tell you about where your grazing management is. So we don't want our cows or our grass finish animals at any stage in 1 through 3, okay? These are underfed animals, right? They're all skinny. This cow looks too happy to be a 1. Every one that I've ever seen that was a 1 looked like they were on the death's doorstep. Their head was usually hanging down, you know, their slobber coming out of their mouths. But anyway, you don't want this. They're starving, okay? They're at the very tail end of their lives. You know, 2 and 3 are pretty light cows. 3 is pretty light. I've seen a lot of 3 cows, and we typically want to have our animals, particularly our cow-calf animals, in 4 or 5 or 6. Okay, 5 being that midpoint ideal place, because 5 cows in the 5 body condition score are going to cycle, and they're going to rebreed fairly consistently with us, more consistently than in 4. 4, you're kind of on the verge, and those cows aren't going to cycle as efficiently and may miss a cycle, right? And it's going to extend your breeding season, and which extends your calving season, which makes, you know, your calves from one end to the other very much different in weight and age, right? So it just spreads that out. A 6 is kind of on the other end of that. It's getting a little bit heavy. They're still going to breed efficiently for you. They're still going to cycle efficiently for you. But if you come up and you hit body condition score 7 or 8, now you're going to lose efficiency in breeding because they're overweight. And that deposit of fat in their body is going to interfere with the breeding cycle, right? So on the other end. So we don't want them to be overweight on the cow-calf side of things. On the other hand, ideally, if we're grass finishing, we want this 7 or 8. 7 being on the low end, 8 being on the high end, 9 is too much, right? There's going to be too much fat on the back, and there's going to be too much trim at the slaughter facility, and you're going to get docked for that extra trim. So 7 and 8 is our ideal for grass finish, okay? At 7, the animals are starting to deposit fat around the tailhead. They're starting to deposit fat down in the brisket. You no longer can distinguish their ribs, and their back is rounding out and becoming flatter. This one here is a little hard to see because it's kind of dark, but the brisket is fully filled out on this animal. You can't even see the tail head on this animal anymore because there's enough fat over the top of that. And they have a good layer of fat over their ribs. And of course, what we're shooting for is that half-inch cover on the ribs. Okay. So how does all of this fit together? How does your stalking rate, your grazing management, your body condition, and the age of the animal all kind of fit together? Okay, so this is coming back to the graph that I showed you earlier, and what I've done is I've basically taken those curves and put them onto a scale that we can that is proportional. Don't worry about the numbers down below. That's just a way for me to proportion out the information. Same with the values on the left side. It's just a way for me to get the graph all situated. But what I've done is taken and overlaid the body condition score index on the performance for production per animal on a production per animal basis. And then looking at this production per unit area curve over that same scale. And so again, you know, over here on this side, you know, we're overstocked on this curve, right? And that's where we get the body condition scores 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? So anything that's over here, we can understand is we're probably overstocked. Our animals are not putting on weight like they need to, or maintaining weight like they need to. This is our cow-calf zone here between body condition score of 6 and 4. And then what we need to do to get those animals, because we tried to do grass finishing in this zone right here, our animals will never get to that body condition score 7 or 8. So what we actually have to do is back the stalking rate off just enough to get the kind of gains that we need, right? To get those animals into that body condition score of 7 or body condition score of 8, right? Does that all make sense? So stalking rate really becomes a driving factor for us to get those animals up to weight at the age that they need to and fit within their body frame size based on body condition score. So your analysis in the pasture should be looking at the condition of these animals. And so you should, be very aware of what these body condition score values are. Okay? And speaking of which, Mealani put together a really good video that's available on our Livestock Extension website on body condition scoring. So that's out there for everybody to go and review. So some key grazing management protocols for grass-finished beef production. So some guidelines for forage allocation should be based on two factors, okay? Estimates of unrestricted daily intake. Again, we don't want those animals to go through any period of time where they need more groceries. If at any point they're lacking for groceries, what happens? We lose tenderness, we lose gain, right? So unrestricted daily intake for our grass-finished animals. So this is calculated as a proportion of the live body weight on a dry matter basis. So common values range from 2.6 to 3.3% for most beef cattle. Okay, we typically use 2.6% of body weight for our cow-calf systems. Okay, that's the amount of grass that animal would need on a daily basis in dry matter to sustain maintain her body weight and lactate and raise a calf. Okay, is 2.6% of her body weight. What that equates to is 26 pounds of dry matter a day for a 1,000-pound cow. Okay, mature cow. Now, we don't have a lot of 1,000-pound cows in Hawaii. Okay, a lot of our cows are heavier than that. But you can use that value, this 2.6%, multiplied by the actual weight of that animal to understand how that affects their dry matter intake. So that from the 1,000 pounds to 1,100 pounds, you need incrementally more, from 26 pounds to 28 pounds to 30 pounds, right? So that's what you'll need to feed that animal. It's the same for grass-finished animals. They're growing. So maintenance level for a grass-finished animal is going to be one thing, but to get them to gain weight, right, they need just that much incrementally more energy. So 3% is a good average value over the production cycle of a grass-finished beef animal. So now you have to understand what weight they are at any given point in time. So if they start at 450 pounds, they hit 500 pounds, they hit 650 pounds, they hit 1,000 pounds, the amount of groceries that they need over that period is going to increase, right? Because it's always 3% of that body weight. So they're going to go something to, less than 15 or about 15 pounds, all the way up to 30 pounds from 500 to 1,000 pounds in weight, right? So that's how much groceries they're going to need. So as they're growing, right, the amount of pasture area that they're going to require is going to increase, right? Okay, so you have to keep in mind that growth of those animals over that time period. And then you need estimates of forage harvesting efficiency, okay? This depends on the grazing pressure and the residual forage desired. And by residual forage is how much we leave behind, okay? So when we talk about harvest efficiency greater than 60%, this has been proven to be detrimental to the rate of gain. So the way to think about this is if we have 1,000 pounds of available forage in our pasture, okay, from the top of the grass all the way to the ground, if we utilize 60% of that, we're going to use 600 pounds of that dry matter, right? That we're leaving 400 pounds of dry matter behind. Grazing that intensely is going to decrease gains. Why is that? Because the farther you graze down into that grass profile, the harder that feed becomes, right? The harder that forage becomes. Cellulose and hemicellulose increases in that. And that means digestibility goes down. And if digestibility goes down, gut retention goes up. And so they just can't get full enough of good stuff, right? If you're overutilizing that pasture, okay? On the other hand, harvest efficiencies of 50% have not been shown to be detrimental to average daily gain. So This is 1,000 pounds of dry matter. Again, if we use 50% of that, and we leave that extra 10% behind, we're leaving 50% behind, 500 pounds, then it's been shown not to be detrimental. So it's an incrementally important thing. It's also important in terms of recovery of the pasture. 60% utilization on the pasture turns out decreases root production on that grass. And then it can't recover that root growth, and over time, that extra grazing pressure results in the loss of those grasses from the system. 50% utilization has been shown to have very minimal effect on root growth. Okay, so again, if you've been through one of my grazing programs, take half, leave half is that rule of thumb that we put out there. So it still works for grass-finished beef production as well. This protects your forage base, and it gives you the best option for your animal growth. Now, I'm not saying that 50% is ideal in every situation, but that's the maximum. You shouldn't go over 50%. You may have to come back and say, I'm going to utilize only 40% and leave 60% behind. If the quality of that grass, the quality of grazing down to 50% is not there to sustain those animals' production. And the only way to do that, the only way to figure that out is to measure it, right? Is to take samples, collect them, get them analyzed to look at what that forage production is at those different increments of utilization, right? And if you want to grass finish and you want to do it efficiently, it's worth the money it takes to get those analyses done. And if you want, you can talk to me about doing that. Okay, the other thing is sort of the grazing management program that you implement. And, often, one distinction we make is rotational versus continuous grazing. If we think about continuous grazing, it's really difficult to manage for that proper quantity and quality of the forage over the entire system, over the entire production cycle of that animal, right? Because we have fluctuations from season to season in terms of precipitation, which affects how much forage is produced. And if you've got a set number of animals in that system, then and your production goes down, you're going to end up with a period in which gains go down. Okay, and so we don't want to have those kinds of situations. If we use a rotational system, something like a short duration rest rotation grazing system, these are best for budgeting for the proper quantity and quality of forage, right? Because we can rotate, we can put animals in, take animals out, move them around in a way that best fits their production cycle and where they're at and what the condition of our pastures are. So it's just much more efficient if we use a rotational system or we use some kind of rest rotation program. And always important to remember how stocking density influences harvesting efficiency and animal performance. The more animals you have on a per unit basis, the more competition you have. So at Mealani, we've run several different trials and several different experiments trying to understand how these factors interact to affect animal performance. And we did some high intensity grazing alongside of moderate intensity grazing and continuous grazing. And what we found is basically the very high intensity grazing systems tend to slow the gain of those animals down relative to the moderate stocking density program, right? And so continuous grazing actually starts out fairly good, but because at some point those animals outgrow the pasture, right, their performance tables off and they no longer grow past a certain point because there's just not enough grass to sustain their overall production. So continuous grazing is not the best system to go in there. While you get some early gains initially, they quickly go away once they maximize the forage in the area. So important to understand. So what I'm going to show you now is some more recent data. And so what we've gone now, we were doing different trials looking at stocking rates and different rotational programs, looking at trying to find sort of the system that best fits with the environment that we have. And what we came up with is basically a moderate stocking density with a moderate rotation program. And we've been carrying animals through that program now for a couple of years. And I'm going to show you the data from animals that we harvested last year in April. We have another group that's going to be harvested this April. And so we basically are harvesting at 24 months because we're doing research. We want to look at what their carcass qualities are up to that 24-month period. Many of these animals are actually finishing prior to that 24-month period, but because we're doing the research, we've got to carry them out to that full period. Anyway, so you can see here, I've taken those animals. We're looking at animals that are male and female, and we've split those groups between small frame and large frame. And so you can see the frame size of each of these animals. Our males, both small and large, small frame are averaging a 5 frame score. Our large frame are averaging a 6.8 frame, almost 7. Birth weight of those animals, not much variation in their birth weight. Their wean weights were fairly consistent except for our large frame males. They were considerably larger. Harvest weights, on the other hand, our heifers were fairly close together, about 100 pounds apart. And the same with almost 200 pounds apart in our harvest weight average for our small frame to large frame animals. And then, so here's our birth to wean average daily gain for those groups, our wean to harvest average daily gain, and then our birth to harvest average daily gain, so from the whole period. And so, we're getting pretty good gains on our steers, even on our heifers, we're getting pretty good gains over the life cycle of those animals at Mealani, okay? And definitely well within the model that, the information that was coming out of Argentina. So we're actually doing better than what they would have predicted. So the chart here, and I'll just point out also, I almost forgot about this, but I just want to point out that there's some differences here. At Mealani, we select out of our calf crop for different things. We select the top end of the males to go into our bull program. And we select the top end of our heifers to go into our replacement heifer program, right? So the animals that I get to work with are the bottom end of that selection, right? So these are I'm not saying that they're the poorest genetics in the state, but they're the poor genetics that we have on the station. Okay, so I'm working with the bottom end of our genetic gene pool at the station for finishing. And so there's a little bit of variation, I think, that comes out of the fact that, we select our males and our females differently, right? We're selecting our females based on early maturing body weights, right? Because we want to breed them back. We don't select our males that way. So anyway, having said all of that, the chart here on the left basically shows the average daily gain by gender and by frame size over the course of their production. When we picked them up on grass in May, we picked them up from the experiment station, and they just stayed on the experiment station. They transferred the animals over to me in May of 2021, and then they went on to grass, and then we raised them out. So you can see this is average daily gain on a monthly basis. We weigh them every month so we can track all of this stuff. Not to say that everybody has to weigh their cattle every month, but sometimes it's good to do because, what we've seen year after year after year after year of all of these trials is that during October and November, we get a slump in our average daily gain. And what that's relating to is that, July, August, and September are in this area is our driest time of the year. It's hot and it's dry. And grass production kind of slows down. But then, along about mid-September and the first part of October, we typically pick up some rain. And it's still warm enough, climate-wise, that our grasses take off, right? And we get all this burst of production, and we get this burst of gain. But it's late enough in the year that we're on the verge of getting cold and wet, which is usually what happens at the last part of October and November. We get cold and wet. And because of that cold and wet, and it's such a rapid transition, those animals' performance levels go down in October and November, briefly. And so they get into this little bit of depression in terms of their gain. So how is this affecting our tenderness values. Could be affecting it pretty significantly, especially when you look at our large frame animals, which is this orange line right here. And last year, their average daily gain for the group actually dropped below 0. Okay, they actually lost almost a half a pound over that month. Okay, in their average daily gain, half a pound per day in that monthly period. Okay, so that could have had a pretty significant effect on their tenderness, right? The others didn't drop completely below 0, right? They were just above even on that period. So, what this tells us, if we're doing this, is that we might be able to target supplementation over this period, get them more energy, right? Because energy is what they would need to kind of fight off that cold, wet weather, right? And so if we were to give them energy over this period to kind of bridge this, and then we might be able to get them to finish at a slightly earlier age. So I would make a suggestion, if you're in a commercial program and that's what you see every year, then that's what you would do. Maybe you only have to feed it for a month to get them through it, right? Just a little bit of supplement, some Vitalix or something like that with lots of energy in it, and then probably get them past it. Now, because we're doing a research project, I'm not wanting to supplement the animals because I don't want to confound the data. So they have to suffer through that process. But anyway, so it's interesting to see where that's at. And how did it affect them? Well, look at the large animals over here. They just flattened off for a period where everybody else was still gaining a little bit. That large group, the ones that require the most energy to sustain their production, just flattened out for a month. Okay. Uh-oh. I did something wrong. Okay, fixed it. Okay. All right, so the last slide I'm going to show you here before we start in with the decision support tool with Dylan. I've done the same animals here. These are the same animals, the same data here, except that this is all their carcass data. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about the carcass data. So this first number here is marbling score. And so marbling at 400 is basically slight. Okay? And as the number goes up, we go through, slight to moderate marbling. Okay? And, it's important because this helps us determine what, the overall quality of that and whether or not they're going to grade, where they're going to grade at. Okay? Quality grade on these is averaging 20, which relates to choice. So 20 is low choice. Okay? And, 21 and 22 would be high choice. So we're well within the choice range. All of our animals graded choice. We actually had one that graded prime out of this group. I think it was a small male. I can't remember. I'll look at the data in a little bit here. But anyway, we did have one or two that were high choice. We had one that was high prime or prime. Most of them graded choice. A few of them were low choice. And that's what these numbers relate to here. This is marbling score. The bigger this number, the better the marbling is. Pay attention to our fat thickness. Remember we said ½ inch of fat thickness. That's our standard. That's the USDA standard for those frame scored animals. Okay. We don't quite get there. We're 1/4 inch here, just a little over 1/4 inch there, a little over 1/4 inch there for our females. We actually had one that was at 0.4, so almost ½ inch, but not quite. We haven't hit ½ inch. Grass-finished animals are always going to be leaner than grain-fed cattle. Okay. This is our hot carcass weight, so you can see the distribution of our carcass weights. Here's our ribeye areas. I said that we went from 11.6 early on in the early 2000s, and now we're within that 12-inch ribeye area. We did have a couple that were 13. I think we had one that was 14, but not consistent there. And then we have the yield grade here. Yield grade 1s and 2s are kind of the ideal. Yield grade 1 means that I think it's 78%, I think 78% of the carcass is usable, okay? Yield grade 2, it's like 74% or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but somewhere in those high 70s that the carcass is usable. As you get to 3s, 4s, and 5, you start losing the usability of that carcass, of the meat in the carcass, right? So this yield grade is kind of important. 1s and 2s are good, so we're in good shape here. We received $2 a pound for our animals, and so now you can see the carcass value. And so I want you to pay attention to the carcass value of our small male and our large male. Average was $13.40 for our small, as $14.92 for our large. Our dressing percentage, which is the carcass weight versus the live weight, is higher in our small animals than it is in our large males. Okay. Body condition score isn't that much different. We graded them. We body condition scored them at on average of 7. And you can see the live price per hundredweight here is calculated out. This price calculated out across their live body weight. So our small animals were worth about $1.02, or 102. Our large were about $1.01, or 101 per hundredweight, right? Okay, so now if you were to look at this, you might say, well, your larger animals did better because we got more money for them. The one thing I would point out is that the difference between the carcass value between the large and the small are not that great. And if I could run 10 of the large ones, I might be able to run 11 of the small, right? Now I've got one more animal to sell. And if you calculate it out, you actually find out that if I'm able to run one more of the small ones, I'm actually getting the same price as I would get for the 10 large ones. Now what happens if I can run 2 extra, 2 more, 12 of the small versus 10 of the large? Well, now I've made that much more money, right? Now, I'm not saying in every situation you're going to be able to run that many more animals, but the ability to run one more head is always going to pay off better for you, right? Okay. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And this 5-frame animal is going to come out at 1,200 pounds. That's going to be their finish weight. Okay. Easier to get them to weight within that 24-month period than maybe this one that's almost 7, which is going to be a 1,400-pound carcass, or a 1,400-pound live weight, not a carcass weight, right? And this is their actual harvest weight, and we actually got this up above, probably because we carried it out to 24 months. I think this group would have actually averaged probably about 20 or 21 months at the harvestable age, whereas this group out to 1,400, they're just making their weight at 24 months. Okay. And we have this decision support tool that kind of highlights this. We're going to use data from individuals within this particular group of animals to run that. Okay. Questions on any of that?
Yeah. What are the genetics on the?
Mahalo and thank you again for watching. I hope the information shared in this video will be useful for your production system. Please take a minute to fill out our feedback or evaluation form by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description box below. Your responses are anonymous and will be used to provide valuable information to our program sponsors and to help support future programs for our Hawaii ranchers and agriculture communities. And then join us August 31st, 2023 for our live Q&A session where you can speak and ask questions to any of our speakers. Mahalo and thank you again for watching.